So let me introduce myself. My name's Jacquelyn Sundberg. It's nice to be here with you all tonight. Welcome. I work with outreach and special projects with ROAAr at the McGill University Library. ROAAr is the acronym for Rare Books and Special Collections, the Olzer Library of the History of Medicine, the Visual Arts Collection, and the McGill University Archives. These days, as we're not able to be together in person, it's a pleasure to be able to welcome all of you from Montreal and all of you who may be from much further away, who may not have had the chance to join us for events at McGill in person in the past. So welcome one and all to my living space, and thanks for joining us. I'm afraid you'll have to provide your own snacks. We can't do that remotely. So a very special welcome directly to those who are involved or have attended the Play On series of events throughout this year, and this is one of them. That series focuses on creating moments of wonder and opportunities for play with our collections here at McGill. And tonight I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kelsey Blair, and delighted to have her with us to guide us through some of our archival foldings with performance, play, and female empowerment, the McGill Archives, and the genealogy of women's basketball in Canada from 1900 to 1920. Now, for all of us, engaging with virtual events is a reality these days and a challenge for some, and many of us face it at the moment. So we hope you'll agree, this virtual space allows us to reach beyond our physical spaces. We are bringing our digitized collections to you, directly to the comfort of your living room. And the stories that go with them are really brought to life by researchers like Dr. Kelsey Blair. We hope tonight's talk sparks moments of wonder, some discoveries, and we invite you to post your questions in the chat for a Q&A that will follow Kelsey's presentation. If you do have technical difficulties, like I said, please post a message to me in the chat or to Julien in the chat, or email, as I said, roar.library@mcgill.ca, and we'll put that address in the chat as well for your reference. Now I will pass the baton to Professor Erin Hurley of McGill's Department of English, and she will introduce Kelsey for you. Over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight to introduce Dr. Kelsey Blair to you. She is a theater, performance, and physical culture scholar. She's also a young adult fiction author and a community engaged artist and activist. She recently completed her PhD at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and she's currently a postdoctoral fellow in my department, in the Department of English at McGill. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the postdoc project and a little bit about some of the many accomplishments of Dr. Blair. So her postdoc project really defines and analyzes a new form of popular performance, and she's calling this ordinary spectacle. And by this she means large-scale, regularly programmed events like touring Broadway productions, Habs games, and contemporary circus performances like the Cirque Soleil in the Old Port, or all the things that have been shut down by public health directives, which she's decided has made her project more timely, and I couldn't agree more. We miss those things. She also has an exceptional record of prize-winning scholarship. She does applied practice in theater, film, and sport, and participates in community outreach and leadership. And running through each of these domains in which she's active is a rigorous investigation of embodied practices and physical cultures. And this is paired with a commitment to exploring and utilizing the capacity of performance to empower and to connect individuals and communities. So let me give you just two examples of that commitment. So Dr. Blair has published 4 sport fiction novels for young adult girls, which are also prize-winning, by the way. And she's the curator of the Activist Classroom, which is a pedagogical resource and a blog online for theater and performance instructors and their students. I'm skipping way too many things, but you'll just have to trust me that Kelsey Blair, as I hope this short introduction has shown, she's a marvelous scholar, she's an excellent speaker, you have much to look forward to tonight, and she's also a kind of ridiculously Renaissance person. So, and I'm a fan. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Kelsey. Kelsey, I'm looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you so much, Erin, for that kind introduction. One of the great disadvantages of Zoom is that I'm now in a close-up, so when I blush, it's like more apparent, which I believe probably was your goal, and nevertheless, thank you for that. So hi, everybody. I also want to extend a thank you to the organizers, so particularly to Jacquelyn, Hannah, and Natalie. In a year that's been filled with upheaval, this event has been remarkably smooth and stable, and I appreciate all the subtle work that you have done to make that true. So I'm going to launch in just a sec. Is all the technology, everybody can hear me and feels good? Yeah, awesome. Okay, perfect. So following the theme of this series of talks, today I'm going to examine the concept of play in relation to the history of women's basketball in Canada from the turn of the 20th century all the way up until the present. I'm going to focus in particular on the early history of women's basketball in Canada from roughly 1900 to 1930, and then I'm going to link this history to contemporary women's basketball. So as we will see, McGill played an important role in the early history, and the archives contain key sources and references that help us trace this history. In fact, it's been an absolute joy for me to sift through the materials. As my bio suggests, I'm a lifetime women's basketball player, and I've played most of my basketball here in Canada. So I am by extension part of the history that I'm talking about. In fact, a big part of this talk is about the extension of history, about thinking about how early 20th century and early 21st century women's basketball playing is meaningfully connected over time, both through historical events and through basketball practice, meaning the gestures and behaviors of playing basketball. So to think about how the practice of women's basketball has developed over time, I'm going to focus on the creation and evolution of a core basketball principle. And now you get the screen share, so I'm going to be very small on your screens heading forward. So in 21st century basketball, oh, hold on, wrong screen. The right screen. In 21st century basketball, the vertical cylinder refers to the idea that a basketball player has a right to an imaginary cylinder that extends around their shoulders, above their head, and below their feet. And if you don't understand that, don't worry. We are going to talk about this concept a lot throughout the course of the presentation. So as I'll show, this concept emerged and developed in the context of women's basketball at the turn of the 20th century. And it has and continues to play a major role in shaping how women play basketball together. But we've got a long way to go before we get to the 21st century. So let's get to it. So in 1899, Nora Cleary, a teacher at Ontario Windsor's Collegiate Institute, read the rules of basketball from a booklet produced by the Spalding Company to a group of female students. Following her reading, the girls attempted to play a basketball game. This marks the first recorded instance of women's basketball in Canada. And in the nearly 120 years since this game, basketball has grown into one of the most popular sports for Canadian girls and women. To understand women's basketball in Canada, however, we have to go back in time 9 years before that first game. So are 8 years, my math, PhD in English, not PhD in math, 8 years. So the inventor of basketball was McGill alumni, Dr. James Naismith. So after completing his studies at McGill, Naismith moved to Springfield, Massachusetts. And in 1891, during his first year teaching at the YMCA training school, he was inspired to invent the game of basketball. He was inspired because he wanted a game for his students that was suitable for an indoor gymnasium and wasn't too rough. As you can see on the slide, you have the first of the headshot, and then he's down here below as the director, when he was the director of the gymnasium at McGill. The original game of basketball had 13 rules. So key rules included that the players could not run with the basketball, and they were not permitted to shoulder, hold, push, strip, or trip an opponent. And they also stated the rule of the game, which was to throw or bat the ball into the basket. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that one. So women in the United States began playing as early as 1892, so only a year after it was created. Importantly, however, at this time, attitudes regarding women's bodies significantly influenced women's participation in sports. So as sport historian Cole Dosh argues, and I'm quoting here, the male medical conception of women's physiology and sexuality reinforced a conservative view of women's social and domestic roles. So, and using a mixture of evolutionary theory and societal stereotypes, physicians explained and reinforced notions of female form and frailty. And this was particularly true in relation to white, upper and middle class women. So while basketball involves significantly less physical contact than football or rugby, which is precisely why Naismith had invented it in the first place, the game was nevertheless considered too vigorous, too quick, and too physical for women in the United States. So female educators were nonetheless interested in the possibility of basketball for women. So to this end, Sanda Berenson and Clara Gregory introduced modified rules for female participants. What you're seeing now on the slide is the first publication of Berenson's rules by Spalding in 1901. They actually came out of a meeting that was in 1899. So Berenson cautioned that without careful supervision and adjustments, basketball could have negative effects for female participants. She argued, a certain amount of roughness is deemed necessary to bring out manliness in our young men, but surely rough play can have no possible excuse in our young women. And she went on to suggest that unless a game as exciting as basketball is carefully guided by such rules as will eliminate roughness, the great desire to win and the excitement of the game will make our women do sadly unwomanly things. So to respond to these concerns, Berenson introduced rule modifications for women. These included dividing the playing space into 3 sections, increasing the number of players on the court, and eliminating physical contact between players. So these modifications effectively turned women's basketball into a distinct sport from men's basketball. As will become clear in the next 20 minutes or so, it also fundamentally shaped how women played basketball in the early and mid 20th century in Canada and the United States. So to this end, now we're going into Canada. The introduction of the modified rules of women's basketball in the United States had critical information for the Canadian context. So physical education for women in the early 20th century was not nationally standardized. Educational institutes in Eastern and Central Canada were large enough to train and hire qualified female educators, many of whom received their training in the United States. These educators tended to adopt the modified women's rules as regulated by the Women's Division of the National Amateur Athletic Federation. In fact, it was the modified rules that Nora Clary read out in her class in 1899. And it is these rules that influenced the women's game in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes for much of the early 20th century. In Western Canada, however, educational institutes were smaller, and male instructors often taught women's classes and programs. So, unlike their Eastern counterparts, Western educators frequently implemented the men's rules. So as a result, there were significant variations between the way basketball was played by women across the country at this time. In Eastern Canada, McGill played an important role in the development of women's basketball. So at the turn of the century, women's sports were flourishing at McGill. And the construction of Royal Victoria College in 1899, a residential school for female students, residential college rather, for female students, further spurred female interest in sports. The 1901 McGill Yearbook offers insight into the significance of the new building and also functions as evidence that building construction has never run on schedule. The author of the building introduction delightfully recounts the following. 3 years of suspense. Who shall find words fit to describe them, words fit to express the mystery that so long shrouded our latest building, even as tarpaulin shrouded the statue of its royal godmother? At first, we watched the walls rising and said to ourselves, next spring, the doors will be thrown open. We shall know that what changes there are in store for us. But spring came and went, and summer and winter too, and we were none the wiser. Baffled curiosity is the mother of scornful indifference. Outsiders began to ask us about every detail of the future management of the building, and we answered truthfully that we knew nothing, and very untruthfully that we didn't care. So in the end, the building was built, and importantly, it included a new gymnasium. And this gymnasium was a striking upgrade from the former gymnasium. I'm gonna go backwards. So an entry from the same yearbook reports, in former years, it was known in a dim, hazy way that gymnastics was included in the regular college course. But so little impression did the fact make upon the average student that many of them passed through their 4 years without having learned the whereabouts of the gymnasium. The conditions are now entirely changed. The gymnasium has become a center of attraction about which the majority of the students gravitate. So importantly for our purposes here, the gymnasium supported the development of basketball. As the author recounts, basketball was enthusiastically taken up by the girls and bids fair to occupy as high a place in conversations and affections as does football in those of their brothers. So as the 1901 yearbook reveals, the female students, referred to as the Donaldas, named after the school's benefactor, Donald A. Smith, loved the new facility and the gym. And particularly the gym helped lay the foundation for the development of organizational structures. And in 1902, the Royal Victoria College Athletic Club was formed. So the 1905 yearbook reveals, however, that it took some discussion before female students agreed that the management of basketball was distinctly under the jurisdiction of the club. Once the women had decided which activities fell within the club's purview, inter-class matches, so matches, contests between the college's yearly cohorts, were arranged in schedules. These matches were coordinated by the students, and they brought young female athletes together to play and compete for several seasons. So we've got the 1905 season, we've got some from the 1908, and the 1912 team. The popularity of basketball continued, and in 1908, it was reported that even before the advent of the chill of November, basketball has resumed its sway over the life and limb of the athletically inclined. So the growth of intramural sports at McGill mirrors the development of women's basketball in Eastern Canada more broadly, where such inter-institution games and tournaments helped the sport grow. Importantly, during this period, the concept of the vertical plane was being explicitly articulated in the rules of modified women's basketball in the United States, the very rules that were informing the playing of basketball in Eastern Canada. So in the first official publication of Berenson's rules, she added a regulation that addressed physical contact between players. And that was that she banned snatching or batting the ball from the hands of an opponent, and decreed that no guarding may be done over the opponent's person when she had the ball. By 1908, the wording of the latter rule was re-articulated as overguarding, which was defined as guarding with one or both hands over our arms or body not in the vertical plane. In other words, players could not touch or enter another player's airspace. So the following images taken from the 1905 Basketball Guide for Women help illuminate this rule. So the first two images, as you will see, show wrong guarding, according to Spalding. And then the third image shows right guarding. And I'm going to walk us through these. So in the wrong guarding images, the defensive player crosses the threshold of the vertical plane and can snatch the ball out of the player's hands. The offensive player then has to hold the ball or pivot away from pressure in order to make her next move. In the right guarding, the players enact the modified rule, and the defensive player is not permitted to cross that plane, that physical space. So consequently, the offensive player does not have to learn to protect her space because the defensive player is not allowed into that space. Instead, she focuses on court vision, on the ability to see her teammates in the hoop, and the execution of the next skill. So as players catch and defend the ball repeatedly throughout the course of a basketball game, this seemingly minor rule significantly impacted how women played basketball during the period. Notably, the rule meant that any player who perfected a two-handed overhead throw was essentially impossible to stop because there was no means to defend her. And this was particularly true for taller players. So it would have massively benefited me because I'm 6'1". So I actually should have been born 100 years ago. And importantly, the rule meant that, again, games that followed the modified rules differed sharply than those that didn't. Despite being restrictive, the rules did not hinder the growth of the game at McGill. and interclass games lay the groundwork for intercollegiate games. To this end, yearbooks and archival photos suggest that between 1908 and 1912, the RBC team played against teams from the McDonald campus, competing for a trophy that was referred to as Madeline. They note, "We have a splendid basketball season, and we are proud to say that Madeline still adorns the library. Both games with McDonald were very close and vastly exciting, and for a while we were afraid that our heroine would be at St. Anne's for next year." I'm going to pause here to note this slide because it's going to come up a couple of times as we head towards the back half of our presentation. So the opportunity to play against women from other colleges and areas was regarded enthusiastically by the athletes. And on February 6, 1920, McGill played against Queen's University in the first recorded female inter-university game in Canada. So described as the most important event of the year as far as athletics are concerned in the 1921 yearbook, Queen's Games took place on Friday, February 6th and Saturday, February 7th. According to the yearbook, the game was also the first intercollegiate gathering of college women between Ontario and Quebec, and it marked an opportunity for both sporting and social interaction. So the game was described as an exceedingly closely contested, both teams being well matched and playing their best brand of basketball throughout. But it was McGill who emerged the victor with a final score of 21-16. Pronounced a social intercourse and the exchange of ideas, which did, quote, much to promote a fine feeling of friendship and cooperation between the girls of Queen's and McGill. The players understood the significance of the game. And in the game, it was introduced as an epoch-making event in the history of Canadian sport, for it was the first intercollegiate game to be played by Canadian college women. And they said it was in the earnest hope of both colleges that this will herald a series of intercollegiate games that will include Toronto and possibly even more distant universities. So the women's hopes were ultimately achieved. In 1923, the Women's Intercollegiate Athletic Union was formed. It helped organize competition for female students in Ontario and Quebec, and was one of the precursors for today's U Sport, which is Canada's National Inter-University League. In fact, that trophy that the players from 1912 were so proud to have in the library was donated to the league as the championship trophy. I'm fairly certain that it's the same trophy that's being described there. So over the next 40 years, both basketball and intercollegiate women's sport continued to develop. In the case of the rules of basketball, attitudes regarding the modified women's rules and the capacity of female basketball players gradually shifted. And after years of debate, the overguarding rule was finally eliminated. This permitted players to defend across both the vertical and horizontal axes. This rule change was indicative of shifting attitudes towards physical contact in women's basketball. So the 1934 and 1935 rulebook stated, although basketball is theoretically a no-contact game, it is obvious that personal contact cannot be avoided entirely when players are moving rapidly over a limited space. The personal contact resulting from such movement should not be penalized unless roughness has resulted. So despite this rule change and the acknowledgement that physical contact plays a central role in basketball practice, a modified version of basketball was used to govern the women's game until the early 1960s. And interestingly, even though I don't have time for it in the talk proper, during this period, modified women's basketball transformed and became what is now known as the sport of netball, as a result of the application of the modified women's rules in England. So those rules are still relevant to contemporary sport today, and they're very relevant for contemporary women's sport, as netball remains a sport that is predominantly practiced by women. So the footage I'm about to show is not of McGill or of Eastern Canadian basketball, but it does help show the style of women's basketball play in 1940. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the Edmonton grads, hold on, I have to re-screen share. They are a basketball team based out of Edmonton, Alberta, that played between 1915 and 1940. They, I'll give you full screen of that. They are well established. They only lost 20 games During that period, they played against teams from Canada, the United States, and Europe. If you are interested in the Edmonton grads, there is a Canadian Heritage Minute about them, and there is also an entire book written about them by sport historian Anne Hall. So that gives us a little bit of a sense of that footage. We will re-screen share that. Actually, we won't. We'll just stay with me for a moment. As I was saying, from the 1960s onward, men's and women's basketball have been governed by a similar set of rules across Canada and the United States. If you want, I won't again get into it here, but I can talk us through the different sizes of the ball, which actually emerged during this period. And in the early 20th century, ball size was standardized across men's and women's basketball. So that actually doesn't come out of this early history. That comes in the latter half. And since the early 1970s, there has been a nationwide intercollegiate championship tournament. Critically, during this period, the concept of a player's cylinder shifted out of women's basketball. And here I am going to screen share again. So actually, let's hang out there for a sec. So according to the International Basketball Federation, the vertical cylinder is the space within an imaginary cylinder occupied by a player on the floor. It includes the space above the player and is limited to the front of their palms, on the hands, the rear of the buttocks, and the sides of the outer edge of their arms and legs. So this principle is critical for conceptualizing player-to-player contact in both men's and women's standing and wheelchair basketball. And here is what some of that contact looks like today. So here's the shift that the result of that the vertical plane rule has had. This is the 2015 CIS Championship between McGill and Windsor. Unfortunately, it's not the one that they win in 2017, but it nevertheless is more fluid and consistent footage. So as we can see, the style of play looks drastically different, or fairly different, although the games still resemble one another. The style of play between 1940 and 2015 is fairly distinct from one another. Sorry, you were in the right place, but I wasn't. So given these differences, the early history of basketball might seem really distant from the practice of contemporary women's basketball. Following the materials highlighted here, though, I'm going to suggest that this isn't the case, and that the women's basketball is connected to this history in three major ways. First, there are very real, very tangible connections between the early history of basketball in Canada and basketball in Canada today. And I'm going to be a little bit self-indulgent here, but in fairness, I am genuinely moved by my relationship to the history that I study. So as I said at the beginning of this talk, I am connected to the history of women's basketball in Canada. This is in part because I am a woman who has played basketball in Canada since she was 5 years old. And it is in part because I played basketball at the University of British Columbia for 5 years. And in 2 of those years, I won the national championship. And I'm fairly certain that the trophy that the 1912 yearbook talked about that gets donated in 1923 is the foundational trophy for what is now a replica of the Bronze Baby, which is the national trophy that gets handed out to people who have won the women's national championship, and again was referenced in 1912. And so that's me with that trophy at that particular time. So again, I've held it not once, but twice. And in 2017, 3 years before the centennial of the first intercollegiate women's basketball game in Canada, the McGill Martlets also won that national championship trophy. So they too were awarded the trophy, bringing the replica home for the first time since the creation of the Canadian Women Inter-University Athletic Union in 1971. This also fulfilled the hopes of women from 1921 that intercollegiate competition would continue. So contemporary women's basketball players are connected to the history of women's basketball in a second key way. So we're connected by these fun historical materials in these archival materials, but we're also connected through our physical practices, what performance studies scholar Diana Taylor calls the repertoire. So for Taylor, the repertoire is a mode of knowledge and memory transmission that works alongside the archive. So unlike archival materials that exist as documents, and I'm quoting here, documents, maps, literary texts, letters, archaeological remains, all those items supposedly resistant to change, like those in the McGill archive, the repertoire enacts embodied memory, performances, gesture, orality, movement, dance, singing. In short, all those acts usually thought of as ephemeral or not repeatable knowledge. As we get a sense of here, the gestures of women's basketball have changed dramatically over the last 100 years. But there are connections between these gestures. Shooting and dribbling have evolved, but they're similar skill sets. Moreover, unlike men's basketball, where the concept of the vertical plane didn't appear in the rule book until the mid-20th century, the vertical plane played a key role in women's basketball in Central and Eastern Canada since the game's inception. And of course, how this rule works in the context of the game has changed over this time period. And this is the third important way that women's basketball in Canada is linked over time, through the relationship between basketball-specific movements and a player's relationship to space. So as we've seen, the vertical plane initially functioned to constrain the movement of women's basketball players by limiting the space that she could take up and occupy on a court. Importantly, this rule was explicitly added to curtail the potential for physical contact and the development of, quote, unwomanly qualities in female characters and female players. But the function of the rule has changed over time. Today, the vertical cylinder governs a range of skills in basketball, from squaring up to boxing out to bumping cutters, all terms that, if you want me to, I can define for you in the question period. And all of these skills are predicated on a player's ability to protect her space. So the basketball-specific skill of squaring up offers an illustrative example. So in basketball, the term square up is used to indicate that an offensive player holding the basketball should turn her body so that her hips and shoulders are facing the hoop. If we were in person, I would encourage some of us to do this alongside me, but since we are not, you are just going to have to watch me do it on the screen. So more specifically, squaring up involves pivoting with one foot planted on the ground. So if you are the basket and I was to receive the ball, I would move from the triple threat position where the ball's at my hip from one side to the other. Usually, a player squares up after receiving a pass from her teammate. So the skill assumes that the player, the offensive player will be closely defended. The defensive player's goal in this situation is to restrict her movement by crowding her space and trying to bat or snatch the ball out of the offensive player's hands, the very thing that Senda Berenson was trying to avoid. If a defensive player crowds an offensive player when she catches the ball, the offensive player must not lean away from the contact, but rather her goal is to, again, rip or move the ball through the contact. She must, in short, claim her vertical column, her physical space on the court. Sometimes this might result in contact with a defensive player. And so the offensive player needs to learn to be comfortable with activity-appropriate physical contact. And significantly, a player's mental and emotional conceptualization of her right to space is integral to her ability to execute a square up in a game. To this point, if I catch a basketball and the defensive player crowds my space, but I don't know or don't believe that I have a right to that space, I'm unlikely to move, never mind risking making assertive physical contact with another human being. Contact which outside of the activity of basketball might be considered inappropriate. However, if I believe I have a right to space and I am compelled by the purpose of the activity to score baskets, I am more likely to risk an encounter with another body and execute the square up skill. So rather than restricting a player's spatial mobility, the vertical cylinder principle now empowers female players to learn to protect and claim their physical space on the court. This offers both a link and a key difference between women basketball players over time. So on the one hand, a player's relationship to space has always been a key aspect of women's basketball. And on the other hand, the specifics of that relationship have changed dramatically. But importantly, the spatial aspect of women's basketball has consistently infused the game with empowering potential for female participants. So despite the modified rules, in the early 20th century, women's basketball offered an opportunity for women to gather, play, and move together. And while the modified rules may now appear outdated and restrictive, they also allowed women access to basketball as a physical practice. Today, the shift in the vertical plane rule, which encourages players to learn to claim and hold space, potentially empowers female participants on the court. Though there have undoubtedly been shifts since feminist philosopher Iris Young argued that women, quote, learn to live out their existence in accordance with the definition of patriarchal culture that assigns us, that says we are physically inhibited, confined, and objectified. Holding and claiming space as an individual who identifies as a female is a meaningful action in the 21st century. And in this context, being able to claim space on the court is a small but potentially meaningful movement pattern for women's basketball players. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that learning to protect one's space through basketball on the court is in and of itself emancipatory for girls and women. The skills of basketball are one of many movement patterns a player enacts over their lives, and each player is unique, a unique human in a unique set of circumstances. Nevertheless, such minor moments of empowerment are possible. Indeed, for over 120 years, the vertical plane principle has shaped how women in Canada move on the basketball court. And while the meanings of these movements, and indeed the particulars of some of the movements themselves have changed, basketball has consistently been a place where women gather to move and play together. And as the McGill Archives help illuminate, these experiences created by these gatherings have prompted important and lasting memories for women in Canada across time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. Virtual round of applause for the talk. I'd like to invite our listeners, our participants, to, you can either sort of give us a hi sign by giving us a visual cue, or raising your hand by, putting a thumbs up or something in your box there. Or you can, actually I need to ask Jacquelyn this, can people unmute themselves?
Sorry, no, they can't.
Okay, so please give me a visual sign, and we will unmute you so that you can ask your question. You're also welcome to type questions in the chat, okay, or comments. So I'll just begin by thanking Kelsey for taking us through sort of the changes and the continuities across more than a century of practice, of physical practice in basketball, that really highlights how a particular set of movement patterns are enabled through this principle of the vertical plane, or of the vertical cylinder, rather, which, as you say, the meaning of which changes over time, but it is a consistent practice at the core of women's basketball from its inception. Okay, so we have our first question, which, Kelsey, I'll just relay to you. In the early history of women's basketball, what were women wearing? Oh, so all those images of skirts and dresses, I'm imagining, is where this comes from. And how did these outfits influence their movement? So another kind of technology, right, that has an effect on what range of motion one has and one's gesture.
Mm-hmm. So women were wearing, as we saw, and I can screen share some of those because they're just amazing outfits. Some of those outfits. And so the long story short is, again, the history of women's basketball and the history of attire changes dramatically over time, as other things do. And in the early history, people did wear skirts and longer shirts to play in, as we can sort of see in some of these early images. I'll go backwards here. So they did play in that, keeping in mind they also weren't, during this period, the court was divided into 9 sections, and each player was assigned a section that she couldn't leave. So it was much closer to netball. There was a lot less running than what we imagine in contemporary basketball, and there was much less contact. So in a sense, these actually weren't terribly restrictive during this period because of the level of vigor of the game. Over time, as we can see by 1940, so we start having shorts introduced. So it's actually paralleling women's fashion very much. So as we sort of have shorts being worn in the 20s, we start to see that inflected in basketball and vice versa. And by 1940, we're starting to see shorts. And again, it's about range of movement. If you want to be really interesting in today's basketball, so something that, and again, this is from 1921. So, but again, by the late 20s, we're starting to, and early 30s, we're starting to get shorts. What's kind of interesting about basketball today is that obviously there's been, in North American basketball, it tends to be baggier clothing. So clothing that allows movement in the sense that it's not very tight, but can be held on to. So the upside being is that it allows a lot of movement within the clothes itself, but the downside being you can be tugged. And international basketball, and Australia is noted for this, but I believe New Zealand plays with it as well, wears a tight uniform that's lycra and is much closer to a swimsuit. And so both of those, over time, we've gone from sort of in women's basketball from dresses, full length, that again, sort of restrict overhead movement a little bit, but allow a fair amount of running movement, through to shorts and jerseys, as we've seen, which is what most of the 20th century was. And now we're seeing a divergence with tighter international jerseys, but also with the contrasting looser wear.
Thank you. So we have another question about, I mean, you talked about the trophy as an artifact of material culture that also takes us from the beginning of the century to now into the next one. And so here's another question. It's actually about the original trophies. Are they archived? And why is it important to use replicas?
And so the replica thing, so I have to say that as a totally geeking out, because it's a thing that I've touched and played with and held, and I think didn't let go of for a very long time. That trophy, I have no idea why it's a replica. Other than I'm assuming it's, so it got handed back, the history of the trophy is kind of interesting. So that particular trophy gets handed in 1921 or 23 over to the Ontario Collegiate League. They then use it until the 1960s, when the that league is shut down in favor of the National League. It gets donated back to McGill, and I believe around that period. And then McGill, then the replica trophy then gets donated to what will become U Sport in the early 1970s. And the first bronze baby was won actually by UBC in 1971. I believe McGill played for it in 1973 or 74. And the only reason, well, not the only reason I know that, but one of the reasons I know that is that McGill, UBC won the first 3 women's national championships, and the next team from UBC to win it was the years that I won. So I don't know why it's a replica. It is interesting that McGill has consistently donated it. The bronze baby itself is also a replica of a trophy from Scotland. So it's a miniature version of a statue in Scotland. I'm not sure why the replicas. I'd be super interested. There may be people who actually know more about the movement of this trophy on this call than I do. But I know that for the women, on the women's side, currently, and I think has been the case, it's a really meaningful trophy within the national championship scheme that has been for 50, 60 years. And I think it's interesting too, because it also it gives us an archival thing that traces the history. So that history is present for the people that win it, but it also records it because all of the names of the winning teams are listed on the trophy itself with little flags.
Right. So just to be really dense about this, you don't get to keep the trophy. The name of your team goes on it, and then it passes to the next winners.
You get to keep it for that year. So your university gets to hold on to it for that year.
Right.
So very similar to what the women in 1912 had, right? When you win it, you get to keep it for the year, and then play for it again.
Right, and then the material artifact is on its way across Canada. Okay, we have, Jen is wondering if the McGill Archives have a copy of the 1904-05 Spalding rule book from which you pulled those photos. So it's a question about how you're using the archives at McGill and what you're finding there.
I believe it does. So you have to, so I can, if you want to email me, I can direct you how to do that specifically. So it has it through the Hathi Trust. So that one is more of a general library than McGill and Special Archives. It requires some special search terms. It's totally available, and I can point you in the direction of it if you're interested. And McGill does have access to them. It also has access through that particular set of collections to rule books in sport, women's and men's, starting from the 1890s forward.
Fascinating. Thank you. Another question about the rules from Jean McCutcheon now. When did the rule change for a player using the whole floor in contrast to defensive players having 2/3 of the floor and not into the opponent's end?
Into the opponent, yeah. So it depends a little bit because the modifiers rules didn't evolve uniformly in place. So this was true within the United States and Eastern Canada. Is the rules, the Spalding rules evolved fairly uniformly because it was sort of one thing. That rule was generally out of place by between 1925 and 1940 on the late side, but it depended specifically on where you were. Because Midwestern United States was a little bit behind in that regard.
Okay, so we have what looks sort of like a follow-up question actually from Kathleen McCrone, who asks, were the Edmonton grads playing men's rules at home and internationally then? Yes.
But they had learned under men's rules, but they negotiated the rules with teams that they played. So if they were playing against a team from Eastern Canada, for example, in 1920, they would have a discussion about which rules would be followed for that game. And frankly, in the early history of the Edmonton grads, before there's more, the rules sort of even out, it's one of the reasons they win. Because if you hadn't been accustomed to playing what we would now just call basketball, but what was at that point men's rules, it was a significant advantage because it was essentially a completely different game. It would be like playing basketball against netball players. Exactly. It was exactly like basketball against netball players.
Right. That's fascinating. We have another question about, again, changes that people have noticed from the images that you show. So Jacquelyn asks, I noticed there's no backboard on the hoop in some of the early materials. So what was the timeline of the introduction for that for women and for men, and did it differ between the two?
Did it differ? It did not differ. So again, it's a little bit, I'd have to check the actual rule book from the basketball backboard comes in. It comes in by the 1910s in the men's game for sure. Keeping in mind the original basket for basketball was a basket. It is sort of the Canadian Heritage Minute peach basket. And if you look back at those original rules, in order to score a basketball in the original rules from 1891, the ball had to stay in the basket. So part of the rule was that it couldn't then bounce out of the basket. Over time, that basket became a net, in part because it was the classic little brother story of it was annoying to make the little brother figure go and hit the ball out of the basket. And so the basket became a net. While that's a little bit of kind of urban myth, it's also that it does mirror kind of what happens in the game. So it depends on where you were because that's a little bit of a facilities question. So the idea of a backboard by the early 20th century, it's absolutely starting to be in the men's game because the practice is evolving at a slightly quicker rate. And then it depends on where you are a little bit from that period forward because somebody has to actually mount the backboard and the basket together. And so it's a gymnasium and architectural question a little bit.
Cool.
But so the short answer is early 20th century, give or take, depending on where you are.
Okay. And Kathleen's back noting that she played basketball in elementary and high school in the 50s at the University of Saskatchewan and in the early 60s, and that was always using men's rules.
Yeah.
So
I would be curious to know where you played.
University of Saskatchewan, she says.
Oh, yeah.
But it looks like she's going to type some more.
Yeah.
Okay. So while she's letting us know,
nice.
From Regina, there we go.
So anyways, Regina, which has a beautiful new gymnasium, which it got in the last 15 years. And Regina is the team, one of a very strong team still, but certainly in the early 2000s in women's basketball that I played against in that national championship final that I won.
Very cool. So we have another question about differences between men's and women's basketball, but this is actually flipping the question because it's about how people report on it. It's not about how it's played, but how it's received. Is there a difference in tone, Michelle McLeod asks, between men's and women's sports reportage in these archival publications? And do you think the people writing those reports were mostly men?
So interestingly, in the things I've been looking at from the yearbooks, they're predominantly, so yes, in journals and in newspapers, they're absolutely a difference. There's a more condescending tone, a tone that focuses more on what the athletes are wearing and sort of how they look while playing, though not necessarily whether or not they're attractive, to be clear. It just has a heavier focus on aesthetic rather than on the vigor of the game, which again doesn't mean we're saying they all look beautiful while they're playing. That's not what it is. The things that I have quoted from are predominantly written by the women in yearbooks, and therefore in tone and in content tend to focus on, actually they talk about the game largely. They write in a very different style than we write today, that's quite evocative and uses vocabulary that's a little more advanced than we would actually see in news reporting today. But those that are written are actually fairly neutral. And what I didn't quote from it because it didn't make sense, but in the 1908 yearbook, there's a quote that they say that, but it's clearly a female student writing, saying that the young men could learn a little bit about passing from their female counterparts. So there's definitely an awareness of the gender divide, but B, women are writing those. If you look at mainstream media, however, there's a huge difference in that period in terms of how they're reported. Well, not disrespectful, because the tone of writing during that time is also very respectful by journalists.
Right. Thanks. I see Jacquelyn's come back, which means we're getting close to the end of our time. But before we go, I want to be sure to get Rona Brody's question in. And she asks, can you speculate on how making, claiming, and holding space more visible, right, and its link to women's empowerment, can you speculate about that for those who teach and coach women's basketball?
Yep, yes, I can. So again, for me, a huge piece of what I think that the sport of basketball, one of the things that's different about basketball than football, for example, is football fundamentally turns on the idea that when you step onto a football field, you give up your right to bodily space. You can be tackled at any time when the play is running. And basketball turns on the idea that you have a right to your bodily space. And so I think particularly for all athletes, for anybody playing basketball, that's true. I think particularly for female athletes, that's meaningful to learn that through the repetition of practice, that you have a right to your space, and to learn how to actually claim that space on a physical court, I think is empowering, and I think has philosophical potential. And for me, one of the things I'm interested in all sports is those rules that underpin them, that shape what they're doing when you repeat a behavior over and over and over again. And so in basketball, the vertical cylinder in particular is interesting because it literally is the principle that shapes dozens and dozens of movement patterns, because the entire game turns on the idea that you have the right to your body. And I think that that's a really interesting idea for both men and women, though I'm interested in women. And I think it is equally interesting that other sports turn on different philosophical underpinnings. Again, football turns on the idea that you do not have the rights. You do not have the right to your bodily space, except for when you're holding the ball, you have some different rights.
Fascinating. Jacquelyn, do we have time for one more? I have just one more question here. Okay, perfect. So this is from Linda Benjamin. And she asks, was the arc of history the same in the US and internationally for women's basketball?
In the US, it was very similar, partially because, so it was very similar up until the 1960s, in part because women's basketball in the United States comes to be governed under the NCAA. So collegiate basketball plays a huge role in shaping the rules of women's basketball from that period forward, in the 1960s and 1970s, from that period forward. So one of the interesting things about basketball between Canada and the United States is Canada follows being very Canadian of ourselves in some ways, half international and half American rules. And the NCAA has played a key role in shaping the American collegiate rules. And American collegiate rules are fairly distinct from international rules. They play with a different size key. They play with a longer shot clock. They play with a longer backcourt. So if you're a basketball person, you'll know what those terms mean. And international rules have also had kind of a slightly different emergence. So to answer your question, the popularity has been similar across the board. The popularity and growth of basketball that trajectory has been true in Canada, the United States, and internationally. The trajectory of international basketball has been governed by FIBA, which is the Federation of International Basketball, that has quite a different set of rules than American collegiate basketball. And the NBA is its own beast. And a lot of those specifics won't make a huge difference for those of you that aren't familiar with them, but they actually make a huge playing difference. So the length of the three-point line is way further away in the NBA. It's dramatically closer in American collegiate basketball than it is in Canadian collegiate basketball, would be an easy example. So those kinds of things shape differences and matter. Traveling is different. Anyways, I can really geek out about those rules, but they're different. The general trajectory is the same. Popular everywhere, popularity like this, different rules, similar practices.
But all have that common philosophical principle that you were pointing us to at the end of the answer to the last question.
And it's actually one of the only principles that's consistent across all of those. But it is a principle that's consistent across all international American and Canadian basketball.
Right, remarkable. Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Jacquelyn, did you have final things to say?
Yes, just a couple final, mainly thank yous. So yes, a big thank you first to Kelsey for such a great talk and for such an interesting exploration of our archival holdings. So much that of course, though I work with the collections, there's no way that one person can know all that's in there. So thank you, Kelsey, for being a guide through the basketball content for us. And thank you, Erin, of course, for moderating. That was great. And three other big thank yous I just have to note before we go is a thank you to the other events people who are behind the scenes and whose cameras are off. Hannah Deskin is online tonight, Michelle and Julien aussi. Sorry, Julien as well. He's moderating questions and working behind the scenes. So a huge thank you to them, and also to the supporters of this series of events, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and to two private sponsors who have supported the series, Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley, that have made this series possible. So big thanks to them. And just to point you all, we do have another event coming up next week in the Play series. We are having a panel discussion about the library orientation game. So if you need a way to play from the comfort of your own computer chair in the next week, you can try out the library's orientation game and tune in next week to hear a panel discussion about what that looks like in the time of COVID. So how do you get to know your library when you can't actually go? So thanks then. Until then, stay well and enjoy your dinners. Thanks, everyone.